Hi guys, welcome to this second video on Descartes. In this video I will discuss Descartes Meditations 2 and his letters with Princess Elisabeth of Bohemia. At the end of Meditations 1, we are left with Descartes in a position of doubting, and the way that he got to that position of doubting is with the building metaphor. He argues that almost all of his beliefs, all of the beliefs he can think of in Meditations 1 are based on the senses, and that the foundation of, in other words, the foundation of my beliefs is my senses. However, Descartes argues that the senses are open to skepticism, and if we get rid of the senses, then that means the entire building that is built upon this foundation of the senses is destroyed. At the end of this discussion, Descartes is in turmoil. At the beginning of Meditation 2, he writes, "As Archimedes required only one fixed and immovable point to move the whole earth from its place, I can hope for great things if I can find even one small thing that is certain and unshakable." In other words, Descartes thinks he can doubt everything. He can doubt some of the beliefs from the senses, he can doubt all of the beliefs from the senses, and he can even doubt the truth of mathematics. So this is why he says he's in turmoil. It's like he's in a whirlpool spinning around and round and round, and if he can just find one thing to put his toe on, one thing to anchor him, he can start from there. That will be his new foundation, and then he can begin to rebuild his beliefs upon that one fixed point. So we can continue with the building metaphor. He had his old beliefs that were based on the foundation of the senses, and then now he wants to begin rebuilding his new beliefs, but he needs a new foundation. And that new foundation that Descartes arrives at is I am, I exist. So he writes, "The statement I am, I exist must be true whenever I state or mentally consider it." This is also called the cogito in Latin. It's called, you might have heard I think therefore I am. That's the English translation of the French version of this argument actually, but when Descartes wrote it in Latin, it was this formulation, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. So why can't Descartes doubt this away? He was able to doubt everything from the senses. He said that he could be dreaming. He said there could be an evil deceiver, even making him be mistaken about the truths of mathematics. But the cogito he can't doubt away, and the reason is this. Doubting is a form of thinking. So if Descartes doubts that he's thinking, then he's thinking. In other words, if he's doubting that the cogito is true, he's proving that it's true. If there's something that can be deceived, or if there's something that can doubt, that thing itself is thinking. And Descartes knows that he has this, or he is this. The word consciousness wasn't around at that time, but that's another way we can think of it. You can't doubt that you're conscious. If you're doubting that you're conscious, then you're demonstrating your very consciousness by doing that. And that's the one fixed and immovable point that Descartes arrives at in Meditations 2. He knows that he's a thinking thing, and a thinking thing must exist in some way or another. So we have the cogito, in other words, that I think therefore I am, or I am, I exist. Those are all different translations or different formulations of that same idea. How can we build on this? What is the next step that we can get from knowing this one thing? In other words, at this point, Descartes says to himself, I know I am, I exist. How can I leverage this? Can I say that I'm a man? If I know I am, I exist, does that mean that René Descartes exists, that this man who's in France in the 1600s, do we know that that man exists? And the answer to that is no. Descartes can't know that he's a man, that he's French, or anything. He just knows that he is consciousness. So he asks, what then am I, or what can I know I am? And that is just a thinking thing. He knows only that he is a thinking thing, that he is or has consciousness. So at this point, he decides to go down a different path. He can't really directly leverage the cogito in any way. He knows he's the thinking thing, but he can't really milk that and take it anywhere. So he then says, let's consider the things commonly taken to be distinctly comprehended physical objects. Basically, he says, okay, I can't get anywhere with the cogito. Let me take a different approach, and I'll just think about the things that I used to think I understood. And that those were physical objects. Maybe I can get somewhere through thinking about those. And Descartes, in this discussion, considers a ball or a piece of wax. Throughout this point of the meditations, Descartes has us imagine that he's sitting in front of a fire and that he's holding in his hand this piece of wax. He contrasts the wax when it's cold with the wax when he brings it closer to the fire. And he points out that the wax has different properties when it's in these different states. Cold wax, he says, smells of flowers, is hard, is cold, is easy to touch. And I like this last one, it makes a sound when wrapped. So if you hit cold wax on something, it makes a sound. In contrast, hot wax gives up a smell, it loses its shape, it melts, it heats up, it's hard to touch. None of us would want to stick our finger in a burning candle, but obviously we could touch it if it's cold. And lastly, hot wax doesn't make a sound if you tap it because it's now soft. And Descartes asks himself, is it still the same piece of wax? How can something be the same thing if its properties have completely changed? The reason that he's considering the ball of wax, again, goes back to the I am, I exist. This is a way of him thinking about himself through the wax. So Descartes himself also changes. Descartes has physical properties that have changed throughout his life. And we all share that in common, right? We all used to be very small. Our mothers used to carry us around very easily. Now, a lot of us, our mothers can't pick us up and certainly can't carry us around very easily. We used to not be able to talk. Now we can talk. And throughout that, we've been consciousness consistently. So the reason that Descartes starts thinking about the ball of wax first comes from his consideration of the cogito. So when we ask if it's still the same piece of wax, we can think of that as, am I still me? Or is my consciousness, the same as what made me me when I identified myself with a body? These types of questions are part of the philosophical branch called metaphysics. Metaphysics means on or above, and when you're thinking about metaphysical questions, you're thinking about questions beyond the physical properties themselves. So we know that hot wax has properties and cold wax has properties, or us at the age we are now has certain properties, us when we were babies had certain properties. And to do metaphysics, to go beyond or above those physical properties, is to ask this other question of, is it still me? Is the ball of wax still the ball of wax? In other words, when we do metaphysical inquiry, we're asking what makes X X? How can I still be me, although I undergo certain types of changes? How can the ball of wax still be the same ball of wax, even though its properties have changed? It's difficult to answer this question and these types of questions and to come to any kind of consensus about what makes a Lamborghini, or what makes me, or what makes a ball of wax a ball of wax. And at the end of this discussion, Descartes concludes that physical objects are not really known through the senses, but through understanding. And by this, he means the following. To say what wax is or what a Lamborghini is, we can't just see the object itself. We have some concept that goes beyond the mere senses. And again, Descartes basically hits a dead end thinking about the ball of wax. He hit his first dead end with I am, I exist. He tried to milk that. Now he went back to physical objects and asked himself if he could get anywhere with those, but he couldn't. And this doesn't help Descartes move forward with rebuilding his beliefs. So he moves on from this line of thought and instead starts looking at another avenue to begin building his beliefs above the cogito. He writes that he's going to loosen the reins for now. Descartes is a bit stuck, so that's why he decides to loosen the reins. In other words, he's he's been very restrictive, and he's going to loosen up a bit. It's at this point that Descartes turns to God. Meditations 3 is called On God's Existence. And it's really with Meditations 3 that he gets all the rest back. He's very slow with the process of doubting. He gets the cogito relatively quickly, and then from there, it's a slow process for him to try to rebuild his beliefs. But once he gets God, everything else follows rather quickly. If you don't like this argument, or you don't find this part of Descartes' argument persuasive, then you won't follow him in his conclusions any further. In our class, we won't be going through Meditations 3 through 6, but just so you guys know, this is how Descartes continues with his argument. He argues that God exists, that God is not a deceiver, and that he knows material objects exist. This follows from God not being a deceiver. And then lastly, he concludes, I have a body with which I sense objects. His argument that God exists really is what allows him to make all these other steps down the line. We go from only the cogito to God exists, and then with that piece, we can rather quickly get back everything else. Descartes' argument that God exists relies on the idea of God, and relies on Descartes having a clear and distinct idea of God. Later on in the semester, we'll see another argument like this that argues for the existence of God based solely on the concept of God. But for now, I just wanted to show you that this is where he takes it next. And we need this to understand his letters with Princess Elisabeth. You'll notice that there's a big gap here between Descartes as consciousness, or as a thinking thing at the beginning, and Descartes as a body at the end. Those two aren't really connected for him. There's a big gap between existing as a thinking thing, existing as a body, and that position is what's known as dualism, that the body and the mind can be understood as distinct. Dualism is important and for Descartes and for Descartes' worldview, because Descartes believes that God exists. Descartes was a Christian, although he, in the Meditations, doesn't argue for a Christian God in particular. That's what he was. And if you're a dualist, then that opens up the possibility of survival of the self after death. If the self is just consciousness or just that ability to think or to be a thinking thing, then it's possible for the self as a thinking thing to live on after death without the body. So in conclusion, in a way, Descartes ends up where he started, but he now has better reasons for the beliefs in his worldview. In other words, he has more justification for his beliefs. Now I will turn to discuss Descartes' letters with Princess Elisabeth of Bohemia. As we saw in the reading, these letters were written on May 16th, 1643. That was the first one. Then May 23rd, 1643, René Descartes replies. Then there was another letter in June 1643, then a reply in June 1643, and then the last letter in this set of correspondence was sent in July. Princess Elisabeth of Bohemia was alive from 1618 until 1680. Because she was a noblewoman, she was educated in a way that most people weren't. Most people weren't literate in this society, but she was highly educated, and she could read Latin as well as Greek. And those are the letters of scholarly discourse. So to be able to understand and know what the people in the educated class are doing, you had to be able to read Latin. Later on in her life, she was the head of a convent. She was an abbess. That was a Protestant convent. And in this role, she had the title of Princess of the Holy Roman Empire. The problem that Princess Elisabeth points to is what's known as the mind-body problem. And this is a problem that philosophers and cognitive scientists are still working on today and are still perplexed by today. So with the letters, what I'm going to do now is kind of briefly paraphrase them. They were written in the 1600s, as you guys saw, and it's hard to kind of get the gist of it. So in this video, I'm going to just give you that short gist of it, kind of paraphrasing and translating a little bit. And then if you have questions, we can talk about those in our class. So in her first letter, she asks, how can the soul produce voluntary actions? By this, she means how can something that's extended, something ethereal, the sort of thing that maybe can go to heaven, how can something like that, of that kind, something we can never point to? And at one point, Descartes says the soul is something you can't cut in half. I kind of like that characterization because it draws attention to the fact that the soul isn't made of stuff, isn't made of matter. She's asking, how can something like that produce voluntary actions? How can it move a body? All of us right now can choose to voluntarily lift our left arm, right? I'm doing it now, you can do it with me. That's something that we can do. And that's coming from our consciousness, coming from what they were calling a soul. And how can that happen? How can thoughts move matter? Descartes replies and says that the interaction between the mind and the body is like that of gravity acting invisibly on objects. Now this seems like a pretty good reply at first because gravity does act invisibly in a way. We can't see gravity, but gravity is what takes things. I'm gonna drop my stylus right now. I'm holding my stylus up, and there I didn't mean to have it hit my iPad, but it hit the iPad. It bounced off the table, and it was gravity that did that. I can't see gravity. But Elisabeth has a pretty smart reply once you read it and you realize this is a good reply. She says with gravity we attribute a material cause. In other words, although I can't see gravity like I could see somebody's arm reaching out and grabbing my iPad stylus, gravity does have a material cause, and it's what's under my feet, right? It's Earth. And they knew this in the 1600s, but we know this even better today. And maybe you guys have studied this in a physics class, that gravity is proportional to the mass of the thing. That's why you kind of float when you're walking on the moon, right? Because there's less mass and less gravity. So gravity does have a material cause. So that's not responding to her question or her objection, which is how can something without matter affect something with matter? Gravity is a case of matter affecting matter. And she says this. So this, again, here is from Elisabeth. She says, it's easier to say the soul has matter than say something without matter moves something with matter. And Descartes replies with this: we're not capable of conceiving of them, that is, the mind and the body, or the soul and matter, as both the same and different, but he says that we have to. And then finally, in Elisabeth's final letter, letter 3, she says the properties of the soul remain unknown. Basically, she's not convinced by Descartes and his answer that, they are and they aren't, and we can't understand why. She wants to understand why. And as we saw in that slide the one with the sand dunes a couple slides ago, she says, given that the properties of the soul remain unknown, Descartes can't answer her question in a satisfactory way. She would rather stick with the theory that the soul has matter, and that's how the soul with matter can move other things. Now, this presents a problem if you think that the soul lives on after death, because we know that matter, the stuff that we're made of, is not going to go anywhere, right? And so if Elisabeth is right, then that presents a problem for Descartes' dualism and for the idea of the self possibly living on without the body.